Flight attendant refuses to serve black passenger. Over dress code, learns he's a famous designer. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to catch their flights. Ethan Cole strolled through the first-class boarding area, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the hurried masses. His outfit, though casual, a crisp white t-shirt, tailored designer jeans and pristine sneakers, carried an understated elegance. Each piece was from his latest collection, though he didn't expect anyone here to recognize it. That wasn't unusual. Most people saw him as just another black man blending into the crowd. The first-class gate agent greeted him with a perfunctory smile and scanned his boarding pass. Her eyes flicked over his attire briefly, a flicker of disapproval clouding her otherwise professional expression. Ethan noted it, but said nothing, used to the silent judgments that often followed him in places like this. "Enjoy your flight, sir," she said, her voice carrying a hint of practiced indifference. Ethan nodded, his own polite smile firmly in place. Years of navigating spaces where he wasn't always welcome had taught him the art of measured responses. He walked down the jet bridge, his leather carry-on slung over his shoulder, his steps measured, purposeful. The plane's first-class cabin was already filling with passengers settling into their plush, oversized seats. Ethan slid into his own seat near the window, placed his bag in the overhead compartment, and pulled out a sleek black sketch pad. He glanced around briefly, taking in his fellow passengers. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit across the aisle was already on his laptop, a flight attendant fussing over him with exaggerated politeness. A young woman a row ahead adjusted her designer scarf while scrolling through her phone. Ethan adjusted his seatbelt and let out a slow breath, savoring the relative quiet. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled his attention. A flight attendant appeared, her blonde hair neatly pinned back, her uniform impeccable. Her name tag read Chloe. She carried herself with the polished poise of someone who'd done this job for years. But the moment her eyes landed on Ethan, a subtle change swept over her features. It wasn't outright hostility, no. Chloe was far too professional for that. It was more of a flicker, a slight narrowing of her eyes as they darted down to his outfit, lingering just a second too long on his sneakers. Her lips tightened into a thin line before she smoothed her expression back into something resembling a smile. "Good evening," she said, her tone clipped, almost mechanical. Ethan nodded politely. "Good evening." She moved on quickly, her heels clicking against the cabin floor, but Ethan felt the weight of her judgment lingering like an unwelcome shadow. He leaned back in his seat, his fingers absently tapping the edge of his sketchpad. This wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. As the boarding process continued, Chloe made her rounds, assisting passengers in first class with practiced ease. She laughed at the jokes of the man in the tailored suit, helped the young woman with her scarf, and offered wine recommendations to an elderly couple seated nearby. Yet, when she passed Ethan, her demeanor grew noticeably cooler, her steps quicker, as though proximity to him made her uncomfortable. Ethan observed her quietly, his expression unreadable. He'd dealt with this sort of thing too often to let it rattle him, but that didn't mean he didn't notice. Every slight glance, every microaggression, it all registered, tucked away in the recesses of his mind, like sketches waiting to be brought to life on paper. When the plane door finally closed and the flight crew began their pre-departure checks, Chloe approached again, this time holding a tray of pre-flight champagne. Her smile returned as she offered glasses to the other first-class passengers. But when she reached Ethan, her tray wavered ever so slightly, and her expression hardened. "Would you like water instead?" she asked, her voice saccharine but with an undercurrent of condescension. Ethan looked up at her, his dark eyes calm, yet piercing. "No, thank you," he replied, his voice even. "I'll take the champagne." Chloe hesitated, her fingers tightening around the tray. For a moment it seemed she might argue, but she caught herself, forcing a tight-lipped smile as she set the glass on his tray table without a word. "Thank you," Ethan said softly, his tone polite yet pointed. Chloe didn't respond, spinning on her heel and walking away with brisk, clipped steps. Ethan exhaled slowly, lifting the glass to his lips. The champagne was crisp, but it tasted faintly of something bitter. He set the glass down and opened his sketch pad. With a few swift, confident strokes, lines began to form a flowing gown here, a structured jacket there. His mind wandered, weaving designs inspired by the moment, sharp, elegant lines tempered by soft, unexpected curves, beauty forged from discomfort. He smiled to himself. If nothing else, this flight would be creatively productive. Chloe returned to the galley, her face flushed with a mixture of annoyance and unease. She exchanged a look with the lead flight attendant, a man named Mr. Dawson, who raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong?" he asked. "Nothing," she said, shaking her head. But her gaze flicked back toward the first-class cabin, where Ethan was now deeply engrossed in his sketch pad. Some people don't seem to understand the standards of first class." Dawson frowned. "Who?" Chloe hesitated before jerking her head subtly in Ethan's direction. "Him, row 3, sneakers in first class." "Really?" Dawson glanced toward the cabin but said nothing. Chloe took his silence as agreement, her confidence bolstered. "Well," she added, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I suppose we'll just have to keep an eye on him." Neither of them noticed the quiet passenger a row behind Ethan, who had been listening intently, her lips curving into a knowing smile. The stage was set. Chloe didn't realize it yet, but her carefully crafted facade was already beginning to crack. And Ethan, with his quiet strength and unassuming confidence, was about to turn this flight into a story she'd never forget. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane prepared for takeoff, casting a warm golden glow over the first-class section. Ethan adjusted his seat, leaning back to settle into the plush leather. His sketch pad lay open on his lap, a half-formed design taking shape on the page, a structured jacket with clean lines and intricate detailing that hinted at the chaos it was born from. Each stroke of his pencil was deliberate, carrying the weight of his thoughts. The engines roared to life, a deep vibration humming through the cabin, but Ethan barely noticed. His focus was on the pencil gliding across the page, the rhythmic motion grounding him, pulling him away from the subtle hostility he had felt since boarding. Art had always been his escape, his way of processing the world's harshness and turning it into something beautiful. A shadow passed over him, breaking his concentration. He glanced up to find Chloe standing beside his seat, her posture stiff, her face frozen in a tight professional mask. In her hands was the dinner menu, a single laminated sheet that she held like a barrier between them. "Good evening," she began, her tone overly formal. "Here's the menu for tonight. Please let me know if you have any questions." Her words were polite, but her clipped delivery betrayed her discomfort. Ethan accepted the menu with a quiet, "Thank you." His calm, measured tone seemed to unnerve her, as though she had expected a different reaction. He noticed her eyes dart briefly to his sketch pad, lingering on the intricate lines of his design before snapping back to his face. "Is there a dress code for dinner too?" Ethan asked lightly, his voice laced with dry humor. Chloe's lips twitched, the hint of a frown threatening to break through her mask. "Not at all," she replied curtly. "Just let me know what you'd like." Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a moment, assessing, before he returned his attention to the menu. He wasn't particularly hungry, but he selected a dish at random and handed the menu back. Chloe snatched it from his hand with a little too much force, her composure cracking just slightly. "Excellent choice," she said, her voice tight. Without waiting for a response, she spun on her heel and marched back toward the galley, her shoes clicking against the cabin floor. Ethan watched her retreat, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. Chloe reached the galley and leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the edge as she took a deep breath. She could feel the tension coiling in her chest, the weight of unspoken frustration pressing down on her. She wasn't sure why this particular passenger was getting under her skin. It wasn't as if he had done anything overtly wrong. And yet, There was something about the way he carried himself, calm, self-assured, utterly unbothered by her subtle attempts to put him in his place, that irked her. "He thinks he's so above it all," she muttered under her breath, her fingers tightening around the menu she still held. "Who does?" Dawson's voice startled her. He had appeared in the galley, his brow furrowed as he looked at her with mild concern. "Row 3, Chloe said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He's just not a good fit for first class. Sneakers, a t-shirt, it's disrespectful to the other passengers." Dawson raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking toward the first-class cabin. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. If he paid for the seat, he belongs here. Leave it alone." Chloe's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. She knew better than to push back against Dawson. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered, gnawing at her as she busied herself preparing dinner service. Back in his seat, Ethan returned to his sketchpad, adding intricate details to his design. His pencil strokes became bolder, more assertive, as though channeling the subtle tension in the air. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers occasionally flicking toward him, their curiosity palpable, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the lines and shapes unfolding on the page. The young woman seated in the row ahead turned slightly, her phone tilted at an angle as she pretended to take a selfie. Ethan caught the movement out of the corner of his eye and stifled a smile. He was used to this, people trying to sneak a photo of him without asking, unsure if it was really him, the Ethan Cole, sitting among them. It happened often enough that he had learned to brush it off. Still, it amused him. The juxtaposition of being silently judged one moment and quietly admired the next was a familiar paradox. He wondered if Chloe would have treated him differently if she knew who he was. Probably not, he decided. People like her didn't change their minds easily. As dinner service began, Chloe returned to Ethan's seat with his meal, her demeanor as frosty as before. She set the tray down on his table with a perfunctory, "Enjoy your meal," her voice devoid of warmth. Ethan thanked her politely, his calm tone once again unsettling her. As she walked away, Ethan noticed the man across the aisle watching the interaction with keen interest. The man leaned forward slightly, his gaze shifting between Ethan and Chloe, as though piecing together a puzzle. When their eyes met, the man offered Ethan a small conspiratorial smile. Ethan returned it with a polite nod before turning his attention to his meal. The food was good, but Ethan barely tasted it. His mind was already working, turning the day's events into inspiration for a new collection. He imagined garments that defied expectations, blending casual elements with high fashion details, challenging the very notion of what was considered appropriate. The thought made him smile. He set his fork down and picked up his pencil again, the lines on his sketchpad growing bolder, more confident. He could feel the tension in the cabin, the subtle shifts in energy as passengers whispered among themselves, but he paid it no mind. This was his space, his time, and no amount of passive-aggressive disdain could take that away from him. In the galley, Chloe peeked out at the first-class cabin, her eyes narrowing as she watched Ethan's sketch. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she was missing, some piece of the puzzle that eluded her. But for now, all she could do was wait, her unease growing with every passing minute. The night was far from over, and the flight had only just begun. The cabin had settled into a quiet hum. Most passengers reclined in their seats, sipping wine or indulging in in-flight entertainment. The dimmed lights cast long shadows that danced faintly with the rhythm of the plane's movement. But for Ethan, the world outside his sketchpad barely existed. Each line he drew felt purposeful, an unspoken response to the tension that Chloe's behavior had sparked. A soft cough broke his focus. He glanced up to see the man across the aisle, the one in the tailored suit leaning slightly toward him. The man hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest, as though unsure whether to speak. "I don't mean to intrude," the man finally said, his voice low and polite. "But that sketch you're working on, it's incredible. Are you an artist?" Ethan gave him a measured smile. "Something like that." The man's eyes lit up, his curiosity emboldened. "I thought so. There's something about your work, it's precise. Like it's alive. I've seen designs like that before, but I can't quite place where." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He closed the sketchpad with deliberate care, not to dismiss the man but to shift the conversation. "I appreciate the compliment," he said simply. "It's just something I do to pass the time." The man nodded, though a flicker of recognition seemed to spark in his eyes. "Well, whatever it is, you've got talent." Further down the aisle, Chloe stood by the galley, watching the interaction with narrowed eyes. She couldn't hear their conversation, but the sight of Ethan being approached by a first-class passenger grated on her. In her mind, he was out of place here, and any attention he garnered only highlighted the disparity she believed existed. "He's certainly drawing attention," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of the plane. Dawson glanced at her, his expression skeptical. "Why does it bother you so much? He hasn't done anything wrong." Chloe's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not about what he's done. It's how he carries himself, like he's better than everyone else." Dawson gave her a long, assessing look. "Or maybe," he said quietly, "he's just not letting people like you define him." The words landed with a sharp sting, and Chloe turned away abruptly, pretending to adjust the galley supplies. Dawson shook his head, muttering under his breath as he returned to his duties. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his sketchpad now tucked into his carry-on. He wasn't surprised by the man's interest in his work. It happened often enough, but something about the interaction left him thoughtful. There was a weight to the man's words, a genuine admiration that felt rare in moments like these. Ethan had grown used to veiled compliments, ones that acknowledged his talent but questioned its origin. "For someone like you" was an undertone he had heard too often. The faint clink of glasses drew his attention. Chloe reappeared, her tray now carrying coffee and dessert for the first-class passengers. Her movements were sharp, efficient, each gesture executed with mechanical precision. When she reached Ethan's row, her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Coffee or tea?" she asked, her tone flat. "Just water, thank you," Ethan replied, his voice steady. Chloe set the glass of water on his tray with a little too much force, the liquid sloshing against the sides. "There you go," she said briskly before moving on. Ethan stared at the glass for a moment, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to undermine him with such small acts of defiance. He had learned long ago that people like Chloe thrived on provoking a reaction, on forcing him to validate their biases. Instead, he took a slow sip of the water and let the moment pass. As the plane cruised through the night sky, the cabin lights dimmed further, signaling the shift to a more relaxed atmosphere. Ethan watched as passengers settled in, some dozing off while others flicked through movies or scrolled on their phones. The man across the aisle had returned to his laptop, his earlier curiosity seemingly satisfied. Ethan pulled out a small leather-bound notebook from his bag. It wasn't for sketches, but for words, notes, thoughts and observations he collected like fragments of a mosaic. He wrote in flowing cursive, his pen gliding across the pages with practiced ease. "First class," he wrote, "isn't about the comfort. It's about the unspoken hierarchy, the invisible barriers drawn not by wealth alone, but by perception." He paused, tapping the pen against the edge of the notebook before continuing. "Tonight, I am reminded that no matter how high you climb, some will always look down on you. The challenge is to rise higher still, not to be seen, but to see clearly." The words felt heavy, a truth he had carried with him for years, but rarely voiced. He closed the notebook with a quiet sigh and leaned back, his gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the world was a vast expanse of darkness, the occasional twinkle of lights below offering a fleeting glimpse of life. In the galley, Chloe paced restlessly, her frustration mounting with each passing minute. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost control, that Ethan's calm, unbothered presence was a quiet defiance she couldn't match. Everything okay back here? Dawson's voice broke into her thoughts. Chloe forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. Fine. Just a long night. Dawson studied her for a moment before nodding. Try not to let it get to you, he said, his tone softer now. It's just one passenger. Chloe nodded, but the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. She knew Dawson was right, but she couldn't let it go. There was something about Ethan, something she couldn't put her finger on, that unsettled her. And the more she tried to dismiss it, the more it lingered, a thorn in her side. As she returned to the cabin, her eyes swept over the passengers, her gaze inevitably landing on Ethan. He was leaning against the window now, his profile illuminated by the faint glow of the overhead light. There was an ease about him, a quiet confidence that seemed to defy the very discomfort she had tried to impose. And it infuriated her. The cabin remained quiet as the hours of the overnight flight stretched on. Most passengers had reclined their seats, cocooned in blankets, their faces lit only by the soft glow of seat-back screens. The hum of the engines provided a steady, almost meditative backdrop. But for Chloe, every moment felt like an eternity. She stood in the galley, her back pressed against the counter, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her mind raced with fragmented thoughts, replaying every interaction she'd had with Ethan. His calm demeanor, his unflinching responses, it all gnawed at her. She felt her control slipping, though she couldn't articulate why it mattered so much. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, her voice barely audible. Yet no matter how hard she tried to shake it off, the tension in her chest refused to dissipate. Ethan remained awake, his seat reclined only slightly, his notebook open on his lap. The words he had written earlier seemed to echo back at him, forcing him to confront the very truths he often tried to ignore. He tapped his pen against the edge of the notebook, his mind wandering. He thought of the years it had taken to get here, not just to first class, but to a place where he could exist without apology. The countless nights spent sketching until his fingers ached, the rejections from investors who couldn't see past his skin, the critics who doubted his vision until it became undeniable. And now, here he was, a silent force in a world that had tried to deny him entry. He turned his gaze to the window. Outside, the inky blackness stretched endlessly, interrupted only by the faint shimmer of stars. There was something comforting about the vastness, the reminder that the world was so much bigger than this plane, this moment, this tension. But even as he tried to lose himself in the quiet, he couldn't ignore the subtle shifts around him, the furtive glances from Chloe as she passed by, the whispers between passengers that seemed to grow louder in the stillness of the cabin. The young woman seated a row ahead of Ethan stirred, glancing over her shoulder. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment before she leaned across the aisle toward the man in the tailored suit. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I couldn't help but notice. Do you think that's Ethan Cole?" The man looked up from his laptop, his brow furrowing in thought. "I wondered the same thing," he admitted. "It's hard to tell without his signature glasses, but the sketches, they look like his style." The woman's eyes widened slightly. "If it is him, that's incredible. I mean, he's a genius. Did you see his last collection? Those coats. Pure art." The man nodded, his gaze shifting back to Ethan, who seemed oblivious to their conversation. "If it's him," he said quietly, "he's certainly keeping a low profile." Chloe approached the pair with a tray of drinks, her practiced smile in place. "Can I offer you anything?" she asked, her tone overly cheerful. The young woman shook her head, her excitement barely contained. "No, thank you. But can I ask you something? The man in row 3, do you know if he's Ethan Cole?" Chloe blinked, momentarily caught off guard. I'm not sure who that is," she replied, her voice faltering slightly. "He's a world-renowned designer," the woman explained, her enthusiasm bubbling over. "If that's him, it's such an honor to be on the same flight." Chloe's smile tightened. "Well, I wouldn't know," she said coolly. We don't ask for resumes when passengers book first class." The woman frowned slightly, sensing the edge in Chloe's tone, but said nothing more. Chloe moved away quickly, her thoughts racing. The possibility that Ethan was someone important, someone respected, clashed violently with the assumptions she had made about him. Ethan noticed the change in the air almost immediately. The quiet whispers had grown more frequent, the stolen glances more obvious. He closed his notebook and set it aside, his sharp instincts warning him that something was shifting. His gaze swept the cabin, catching the furtive looks of the passengers and, more noticeably, Chloe's stiff posture as she hovered near the galley. She looked like a storm about to break, her usual composure fraying at the edges. It wasn't hard to guess why. The dynamics had shifted, and she was scrambling to regain control. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his expression calm, but his mind alert. He had been here before, on the precipice of being recognized, of having his identity shift the narrative. It was a delicate balance, one he navigated with care. He wasn't in the habit of announcing himself, of wielding his success as a weapon, but he wasn't above letting others reveal their own character, their own prejudices, in the absence of such knowledge. Chloe returned to the galley and grabbed her phone, quickly opening a search engine. She typed "Ethan Cole Designer" into the search bar, her fingers trembling slightly. As the results loaded, her screen filled with images of the man she had dismissed as unworthy of first class. His face was unmistakable, the sharp jawline, the intense eyes, the signature glasses he occasionally wore for public appearances. Her breath caught as she scrolled through articles detailing his meteoric rise in the fashion world. His collections were hailed as revolutionary, blending cultural influences with modern elegance. His work had graced runways in Paris, Milan, and New York, and he was frequently cited as one of the most influential designers of his generation. Chloe's stomach churned. She felt the weight of her assumptions crashing down on her, the realization of her mistake settling like a stone in her chest. But instead of admitting fault, her defensiveness flared. "It doesn't matter," she muttered to herself. "He's still out of line. First class has standards." The words sounded hollow even as she spoke them, but she clung to them desperately, unwilling to confront the full extent of her bias. Ethan watched her from his seat, his expression unreadable. He could see the cracks forming, the way her polished exterior was beginning to crumble under the weight of her own actions. He didn't need to say anything. The truth was already unraveling around her, and the flight was far from over. The plane glided steadily through the night sky, the hum of its engines a steady rhythm that wrapped the cabin in a cocoon of white noise. Chloe remained in the galley, her mind churning as she stared blankly at her phone. The images of Ethan Cole, the Ethan Cole, refused to leave her thoughts. Every photo, every headline, every glowing review was a jarring reminder of the assumptions she had made, assumptions now unraveling with each passing moment. Her throat felt dry, and her palms grew clammy as she set her phone down. She didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it. The man she had dismissed, subtly insulted, and ignored couldn't possibly be the same Ethan Cole whose designs were celebrated worldwide. But deep down, she knew. The confident way he carried himself, the way he calmly endured her barbs without lowering himself to her level, it all fit. Chloe's pride wouldn't let her admit she was wrong. Not yet. Instead, she latched onto her anger, twisting it into a fragile shield against the rising tide of shame. She busied herself with rearranging items on the galley counter, her movements quick and jerky. She told herself she was doing her job, but in truth, she was avoiding the inevitable confrontation with her own conscience. Ethan sat quietly in his seat, his body still, but his mind alive with thought. The whispers around him had grown louder, the occasional glance from passengers now lingering longer. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, a ripple of recognition spreading like wildfire. He had seen this before, the way people recalibrated their behavior once they realized who he was. He didn't relish the attention. If anything, it often left him feeling exposed, as though the walls he had built to protect himself were suddenly paper thin. but he had learned to navigate these moments with grace, using them as opportunities to observe rather than react. The man across the aisle spoke again, his voice soft but tinged with excitement. "I don't mean to pry," he said, leaning slightly toward Ethan, "but are you Ethan Cole?" Ethan turned his head slowly, meeting the man's gaze. He considered his response carefully, weighing the pros and cons of revealing himself. Finally he nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "I am," he said simply. The man's eyes widened and his expression shifted into one of genuine admiration. "Wow, I thought so. It's an honor to meet you. I've followed your work for years. Your collections are extraordinary." "Thank you," Ethan replied, his tone warm but measured. He extended his hand, and the man shook it enthusiastically. The interaction was quiet, subtle, but it didn't go unnoticed. The young woman seated nearby leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "Excuse me," she said, her voice hesitant but eager. "Are you really Ethan Cole, the designer?" Ethan offered her the same polite nod. "Yes, I am." Her face lit up with a mixture of awe and excitement. "I can't believe this. Your work it's incredible. I saved up for months to buy one of your scarves. It's my favorite piece. I wear it everywhere." Ethan chuckled softly. "I'm glad you like it. Thank you for supporting my work." The small exchange drew the attention of other passengers, the whispers growing louder as more people began to recognize him. The energy in the cabin shifted, a subtle undercurrent of respect replacing the earlier indifference. Even those who didn't know his name could sense the importance of the moment. Chloe's stomach tightened as she watched from the galley. She couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language of the passengers was unmistakable. Ethan was engaging with them, his calm presence commanding their attention in a way that felt effortless. The admiration on their faces was clear, and it only deepened Chloe's unease. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "It doesn't change anything," she muttered under her breath, though the words felt hollow. Her mind raced with excuses, justifications for her behavior, but none of them held up under scrutiny. Dawson appeared beside her, his brow furrowed as he followed her gaze. "What's going on out there?" he asked, his voice low. Chloe hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Apparently, he's someone important," she said vaguely, her tone clipped. Dawson raised an eyebrow. "Important enough for half the cabin to be talking about him?" Chloe didn't answer, her jaw tightening as she turned away. Ethan, meanwhile, remained composed as more passengers approached him, their curiosity and admiration growing with each interaction. He handled the attention with practiced ease, his humility shining through despite the growing recognition. He answered questions about his work, his inspirations and his journey, offering glimpses into the world he had built with his own hands. The young woman who had first recognized him leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You've been so gracious, but I can't help wondering, why didn't you say something earlier? If it were me, I'd make sure everyone knew who I was." Ethan smiled, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Because that's not who I am," he said simply. "I'd rather people see me for how I carry myself, not for what I've achieved. Titles and recognition can blind people to what really matters." The woman nodded slowly, her expression shifting into one of quiet respect. "That's really admirable." As the cabin settled again, Chloe couldn't suppress her growing dread. The passengers' shift in attitude had made it clear. Ethan Cole was someone she couldn't dismiss, someone whose presence demanded more than her shallow assumptions. But the hardest truth of all was one she wasn't ready to face, her own prejudice, laid bare for all to see. The plane continued its steady journey, but for Chloe, the distance to their destination felt impossibly long. She knew the moment of reckoning was near, and the weight of it pressed down on her like a storm cloud ready to break. The stillness of the cabin was deceptive. While most passengers drifted in and out of sleep, the undercurrent of tension remained, coiling tighter with every passing moment. Chloe hovered near the galley, her posture stiff, her mind racing. She couldn't escape the truth now. The man she had dismissed, belittled and ignored was Ethan Cole, a global icon in the fashion world. Her earlier assumptions about him, judgments born of his casual attire and skin color, had turned into a slow, burning shame. But instead of softening her, it hardened her resolve. Chloe told herself she had been right to uphold first-class standards, even if it now felt like a flimsy defense. She clung to her pride as if it were a lifeboat, unwilling to admit, even to herself, the enormity of her mistake. Ethan remained composed, his gaze now focused out the window as the plane cut through the night sky. His calm exterior belied the quiet storm inside him. Though he rarely allowed others' opinions to affect him, Chloe's behavior had struck a chord. It wasn't just her judgment of him, it was the subtle reinforcement of a lifetime of biases he had fought against. He had spent years proving himself in a world that wasn't built for him, carving out a space where his talent and vision spoke louder than the barriers placed before him. Yet here he was again, faced with the same tired assumptions. The difference now was that he had the power to respond not with anger, but with the quiet dignity that had always set him apart. Dawson returned to the galley, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Chloe," he said, his voice low but firm, "we need to talk." She turned to him, her face carefully neutral. "About what?" "About how you've handled this flight," he replied, crossing his arms. "I've seen how you've treated Mr. Cole, and now that we know who he is—" "It doesn't matter who he is," Chloe snapped, cutting him off. Her voice was sharper than she intended, and she quickly glanced around to make sure no passengers had overheard. "Rules are rules. If he wants to be treated like a first-class passenger, he should dress the part." Dawson's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about the dress code, and you know it. You judged him the moment he walked onto this plane." Chloe opened her mouth to respond, but found herself unable to form the words. Dawson's accusation hung heavy in the air, and for the first time she felt the cracks in her own justification. "I'm just doing my job," she muttered, her voice quieter now. "No," Dawson said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're letting your biases cloud your judgment. And if you don't fix it, it's going to cost you." As the plane prepared for its final meal service, Chloe pushed herself back into action, trying to regain a semblance of control. She wheeled the cart down the aisle, her movements robotic, her smile forced. When she reached Ethan's row, her hands trembled slightly as she placed his tray on his table. "Your meal," she said stiffly, avoiding his gaze. Ethan looked up, his dark eyes calm but piercing. He studied her for a moment, the weight of his silence pressing down on her. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "Thank you." The simplicity of his response only deepened the ache in her chest. She had expected anger, indignation, some outward sign of resentment. Instead, his composure left her feeling smaller than ever. As Ethan ate, the man across the aisle leaned over once more, his tone now tinged with indignation. "I couldn't help but notice how the staff has treated you," he said. "It's unacceptable. Have you thought about reporting it?" Ethan shook his head, a faint smile touching his lips. "I don't need to," he said. "Actions speak louder than complaints. People reveal themselves in how they treat others, and that's punishment enough." The man nodded slowly, his respect for Ethan growing. "Still," he added, "it's remarkable how calm you've been. Most people wouldn't have handled it the way you did." Ethan glanced toward the galley where Chloe stood, her back to the cabin. "Everyone has their battles," he said quietly. "Some just choose the wrong ones." As the plane began its descent, Chloe's unease grew. She had spent the flight convincing herself that she was in the right, but now, with every glance toward Ethan, her certainty wavered. The passengers' admiration for him, their quiet disapproval of her actions, had created a tension she could no longer ignore. She busied herself with securing the cabin for landing, her movements hurried and unsteady, When she passed Ethan's seat for the final check, he looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Have a safe landing," he said, his voice calm, almost kind. Chloe froze for a moment, caught off guard by his unexpected grace. She managed a stiff nod before continuing down the aisle, her chest tightening with a mix of shame and confusion. The plane touched down smoothly, and the cabin filled with the sounds of passengers gathering their belongings. Ethan moved deliberately, his sketchpad tucked neatly into his bag, his every action measured. He was in no rush, knowing that the end of the flight marked the beginning of another story. As he stepped into the aisle, the man across from him reached out a hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice earnest. "Not just for your work, but for how you've handled all of this. You've shown a lot of people what real class looks like." Ethan shook his hand, a quiet smile on his lips. "Take care," he replied before turning toward the exit. Chloe watched from the galley as Ethan walked away, his presence commanding even in his quiet departure. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like a physical force. She wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but the words caught in her throat. By the time she found the courage to step forward, Ethan was gone, leaving her with nothing but the echoes of her own regret. The plane emptied slowly, passengers shuffling through the narrow aisle as they gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark. Chloe stood at the galley entrance, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Each person who passed seemed to glance at her a little too long, their expressions unreadable but heavy with implication. The whispers had not stopped, and even though she couldn't hear the words, she felt them. The recognition of Ethan Cole had spread like wildfire among the passengers. As they left, many looked back at the quiet man who had shown more dignity than Chloe had afforded him. Ethan waited patiently near the exit door, his carry-on slung over his shoulder. His posture was relaxed, but his mind was alive with thought. He had no desire for retribution. His principles had never aligned with the idea of vengeance. Still, the weight of the interaction with Chloe lingered, not as anger, but as a reminder of the prejudice that still pervaded spaces like these. He glanced out the window, the golden glow of the runway lights casting long, flickering shadows. There was a kind of poetry in it, he thought, a small beacon of light against the vast darkness. Chloe stepped into the cabin to assist with the final checks, but her movements were hesitant. She couldn't shake the growing knot in her stomach. She had replayed the flight in her mind dozens of times already, and no matter how she tried to rationalize her actions, the truth remained. She had treated Ethan unfairly, based solely on assumptions. As she approached the exit, she saw him standing near the door. Her chest tightened, her pulse quickening as she realized she couldn't avoid him any longer. Ethan turned as Chloe approached, their eyes meeting for the first time, without the veil of performance or pretense. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence between them thick and heavy. Chloe swallowed hard, her carefully composed mask beginning to crack. "Mr. Cole," she began, her voice quieter than she intended. I wanted to say—" Ethan held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. His expression was calm, but there was a weight to his gaze that silenced her more effectively than words could have. "There's no need," he said, his voice steady but firm. "What's done is done." Chloe felt her chest tighten further, his words cutting through her defenses like a blade. She started again, but the look in his eyes stopped her once more. It wasn't anger she saw there, but something far more profound, disappointment. "You know," Ethan continued, his tone almost reflective, "I've encountered people like you before. People who see what they want to see and ignore what's real. I used to think I needed to prove myself to them, but I've learned that their perception of me says more about them than it ever will about me." His words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Chloe's breath hitched, her carefully constructed walls crumbling under the weight of his calm rebuke. "I hope," Ethan added, his gaze unwavering, "that the next time you meet someone who doesn't fit your idea of first class, you'll choose to see them for who they are, not who you think they should be." Chloe opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She felt exposed, her biases laid bare in a way she could no longer deny. All she could do was nod, the lump in her throat, making it impossible to speak. Ethan gave her one last look, then turned and stepped off the plane, his footsteps echoing softly down the jet bridge. Chloe stood frozen, her hands trembling at her sides. As the cabin crew completed their final duties, Dawson approached Chloe, his expression unreadable. "Everything okay?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Chloe nodded stiffly, her gaze fixed on the empty jet bridge. "I think so," she said quietly, though the words felt hollow. Dawson studied her for a moment before sighing. "You know, it's not the first time I've seen something like this," he said, his tone soft but firm. "But it doesn't make it any easier to watch. People make mistakes, Chloe. The question is whether you're willing to learn from them." Chloe didn't respond, her thoughts spinning too fast to form a coherent reply. Dawson's words hit her harder than she expected, the truth of them cutting through the fog of her pride and defensiveness. Ethan walked down the jet bridge, his steps unhurried, his expression serene. The airport was quiet at this late hour, the fluorescent lights casting a stark glow on the polished floors. A driver waited for him near the baggage claim, holding a sign with his name in neat, bold letters. "Mr. Cole." The driver greeted him with a smile. "Welcome back. Shall we head to your hotel?" Ethan nodded, offering a polite smile in return. "Yes, thank you." As he slid into the back seat of the sleek black sedan, Ethan leaned his head against the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and white. He felt a sense of closure, knowing that he had handled the situation on the plane with integrity. Yet, a lingering sadness remained a reminder of the barriers that still existed, even in the most refined spaces. Back on the plane, Chloe sat in the galley, her head in her hands. The cabin was empty now, the passengers gone, and the crew busied themselves with post-flight duties. Dawson approached her again, his voice softer this time. "Take it from someone who's been doing this a long time," he said. "You can't undo what happened tonight, but you can decide what kind of person you want to be moving forward." Chloe lifted her head, her eyes red and glassy. "I didn't mean to—" She trailed off, her voice breaking. "I know," Dawson said, his tone gentle. "But intent doesn't erase impact. You have to own it, Chloe. That's the only way to grow." She nodded slowly, her mind replaying Ethan's parting words. They had struck a chord deep within her, forcing her to confront the person she had been and the person she wanted to become. As the car pulled up to his hotel, Ethan stepped out and took a deep breath of the cool night air. He glanced up at the towering building, its lights twinkling like stars against the dark sky. For a moment he stood still, the weight of the day settling over him. Then he smiled, a small, quiet smile that carried with it a sense of resolve. He had faced prejudice, as he had so many times before, and he had risen above it. But more importantly, he had left an imprint, not just on the passengers who witnessed the flight, but on Chloe as well. Ethan Cole had always believed in the power of transformation, not just in fashion but in people. And tonight, he hoped, had been the beginning of a transformation for someone who needed it most. The hotel lobby was serene, a contrast to the turbulence of the flight. Ethan stepped inside, greeted by the warmth of polished wood and soft lighting. The concierge recognized him instantly, offering a respectful nod as Ethan passed. He appreciated the quiet dignity of such places, where his presence wasn't questioned, but honored. Yet tonight, the recognition felt weightier, layered with the events of the flight. As he rode the elevator to his suite, Ethan reflected on the interaction with Chloe. He didn't harbor anger, he never let such moments linger as bitterness. But he knew the impact of his words, and he hoped they would spark something deeper within her, a kind of self-awareness that could lead to growth. Back at the airport, Chloe remained in the galley long after the last passenger and crew member had left. The empty plane felt cavernous, the silence amplifying her thoughts. Dawson's words echoed in her mind. You have to own it. Her chest felt tight, her breath shallow as she replayed her actions throughout the flight. Each moment her dismissive tone, the condescending comments, the purposeful neglect played back like scenes in a movie she wished she could rewrite. For the first time, she allowed herself to fully feel the weight of what she had done. Chloe pulled out her phone and reopened the article she had read earlier about Ethan Cole. She lingered on one photo in particular. Ethan, standing on a runway, surrounded by models wearing his designs. His expression was proud but not arrogant, his eyes sharp with focus and warmth. It struck her then how much grace he had shown in the face of her behavior, a grace she hadn't deserved. The following morning, Ethan sat in the corner of a sunlit cafe, a steaming cup of coffee beside him. His sketchpad lay open, the designs from the flight now fully realized. Each line told a story, the tension of the evening woven into sharp angles and flowing curves. He had transformed the experience into something tangible, something meaningful. A quiet ping interrupted his thoughts. He glanced at his phone, seeing an email notification from the airline. He opened it with mild curiosity, expecting a standard post-flight survey. Instead, it was a letter of apology from the CEO, acknowledging the events on the flight and assuring him that the staff involved would undergo sensitivity training. Ethan read the email twice before setting his phone aside. He appreciated the gesture, but he knew the true change needed to come from individuals like Chloe, not just the policies of a corporation. Chloe sat in her small apartment, her uniform neatly folded on a chair beside her. She had spent the night drafting and redrafting an email, each version feeling inadequate. But now, as the morning sunlight streamed through her window, she felt a spark of determination. With trembling fingers, she typed a final version. Subject: an apology. Dear Mr. Cole, I am writing to apologize for my actions during your flight yesterday. I realize now how my assumptions and behavior were not only unprofessional, but deeply unfair to you. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and for that, I am truly sorry. Your composure and kindness throughout the flight were more than I deserved. You didn't owe me that grace, yet you showed it anyway. It has given me a lot to reflect on. Not just about how I treat passengers, but about the kind of person I want to be. Thank you for your patience and for the lesson I didn't know I needed. I'm committed to doing better, both in my work and beyond. Sincerely, Chloe Whitman. She hesitated before hitting send, her finger hovering over the button, but then she thought of Ethan's words. Actions speak louder than complaints. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the button, watching as the email disappeared into the void. Ethan received the email later that evening, his phone lighting up as he prepared to head to an event. He read Chloe's words carefully, his expression softening. He could tell the apology was sincere, and though it didn't erase what had happened, it was a step forward. He drafted a brief reply. Subject: an apology. Dear Chloe, thank you for your message. It takes courage to reflect on one's actions and admit fault, and I respect you for that. Growth is a process, and this is an important step. I hope this experience leads to greater understanding, not just in your work, but in all aspects of life. Wishing you the best, Ethan Cole. As he sent the email, Ethan felt a sense of closure. He had turned the page, both literally and figuratively, leaving the events of the flight behind as another story in the tapestry of his life. Chloe kept Ethan's response saved on her phone, rereading it on days when the weight of her guilt resurfaced. She threw herself into the airline's sensitivity training, volunteering to lead discussions on bias and fairness. She didn't tell anyone why she was so invested, but the lessons from that flight stayed with her, shaping her into a better version of herself. Ethan continued to move through the world with quiet confidence, his designs gaining even greater acclaim. Though he rarely spoke about the incident on the flight, it lived on in his work, a reminder that even the smallest interactions could spark meaningful change. And somewhere, in the quiet exchanges of unspoken understanding, both Ethan and Chloe carried forward the lessons of that night, proof that even the darkest moments could lead to light. And so, what started as a flight full of assumptions ended as a powerful lesson in humility and respect. This story reminds us all to look beyond appearances and treat everyone with dignity, because we never truly know who we're encountering. If this story moved you or gave you something to think about, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are many more stories like this waiting to be told, and I'd love for you to join me on this journey. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.